one of our precinct workers from, was it precinct 4 that brought this bottle into our office, but this bottle was found right after the 2017 wildfire. And so Dr. Steffans is going to talk about the effects of fire. Well, Tim, here's one of the effects of fire. That fire got so hot that it melted and reshaped this bottle. And if you want to come look at it, it may not look to your eye out there, but it's amazing how it changed this bottle right here. And so we thought that was a pretty good illustration of how hot some of these fires can get and the damage that they can do. So Dr. Tim Steffans is our area range specialist for the Texas A&M AgriLife Extension Service for districts 1, 2, and 3, a little bit of 3. That's all of the Texas Panhandle from Lubbock all the way up to here, and then out towards Wichita Falls and that area as well. So Tim also has a joint appointment at West Texas A&M University. He is the range specialist for the Ag Sciences Department there at WT. About 7 or 8 years ago, Tim came to me and said, I've got this dream and this idea about a grass grazing and animal management school. He wanted me to take a look at it. And he said, I've been thinking about this for 20 years, and a lot of you guys in this room have taken this course. It's a 40-hour in-depth training of grass grazing and animal management, and we do it over a 10-month period of time. We meet once a month for 4 hours right here in this room. And at first, I think Tim wanted a maximum of 30 students. We had 29. Then we had 30 the next year. We've done it for 5 years in a row. So I'm planting a seed with you because we're going to offer this opportunity at the Beef Cattle Conference coming up in April. And so one of the great aspects of our extension work has become through the in-depth training about range, soils, juniper trees, salt cedars, things of that nature that Dr. Steffans has really got a passion for. He was a rancher himself for a very large Indian tribe out in Arizona and New Mexico. And he's got firsthand experience and skin in the game. So he's not just one of these guys that teaches out of a book. He's actually done a lot of these things for himself. So Dr. Steffans, thanks for being here today. You've got a lot to say about fire and wildfire and the use of fire as a tool even. So thank you very much. Let's give Dr. Tim Steffans a nice round of applause. Tim, if you'll keep this up like this so that people on the can hear it, please.
Thank you, Andy. I've got a fair bit to cover here, as you can see. I'm not going to talk so much about kind of what to do about fire as I am about what to do, what happens during fire, and then kind of what to do about it afterwards. And so we'll talk about it, kind of what determines the effects that fire has, then a little bit at different scales, what happens to plants, and then what happens to plant communities, and a little bit about conditions before, during, and after the fire, and how that's going to determine the effects that we have. A little bit about how management interacts with those conditions, how we can mitigate those conditions to some extent, and then a little bit of I'm not afraid, I guess, to open a can of worms. We're going to talk a little bit about wildfire versus prescribed fire a little bit, and where it might appropriately be used. When we have a fire, from a plant standpoint, now there are a lot of fire bugs that will argue with me about this, but one of the things is we lose photosynthetic capacity. Basically, we have a very severe defoliation of it. Now, fire guys will say, well, fire ain't the same as grazing, and it is. But we're still taking off leaf material. The thing we do with a fire quite often that we don't do with grazing is we're going to take away not only the leaf cover, but we take away a lot of the litter. And when we lose that litter, that's when we start to get unstable soils. We start to get higher evaporation rates. We lose some of the nutrients off of the area. And that is, in my view, I cannot come up with a time when that would be a good thing. We lose some individual plants. Sometimes that's good in the case of juniper. Sometimes that's bad in the case of some of our better plants. In the case of something like Threon, that would be a great thing. But we do lose some. We're going to lose some of the nutrients. Some people will tell you, well, it's just like fertilization. Watch those people because they will lie to you again. Now, what we do get is more soil warming that can cause organic matter to turn over quicker. But that's going to be at the expense of we've lost some nutrients from the system. So it's like a temporary fertilization effect, but it's at a long-term cost, in my view. So we get the increased turnover, and we will get some changes in competitive relationships among plants. We're going to set back shrubs a little harder than we do grasses. We're going to, in the case of Threon, Threon is very susceptible when it burns. It is not as likely to burn as some other grasses. But if we can catch it on fire, it sits on a little pedestal usually, and we can cook that crown and it goes away. So sometimes this can be a good thing if we can manage conditions correctly. Oftentimes plants are weakened, similar to what they would be if we graze them very severely. We're going to have more erosion susceptibility. I was talking to a man who just had a fire on his place, and I said, this is where you're going to be kind of glad you've got some shinnery and some sand sage. Those roots will be there and kind of keep that sand tied down, where when you lose that grass cover, you also expose it where you can blow out around the roots, and then you're really in a lot of trouble. We get higher evaporation rates, we get higher soil temperatures. The higher soil temperatures may cause a little earlier green up in the spring. But we're also going to get soils drying out worse because of the lack of cover, the darkening of the soil, and and higher wind velocities at the soil surface. We may lose those nutrients, especially if we have nothing there to use those nutrients once they're released from that organic matter. So if we can have just if we've got good moisture afterwards and plants come right away, we just turn those nutrients over into plants and it stays in the system. If we don't, they just volatilize, and now we are much poorer than we were before. And then we may get a lot of disturbance species. And this causes a lot of people a lot of heartburn sometimes, because we end up with what a lot of people will call weeds. And in normal circumstances, they probably are. But after a fire, if it's covering up the dirt, this is not a bad thing. We got time to take care of that later on. Let's get it haired over and get it covered up. For an individual plant, there's not that much difference between a fire and a really severe grazing. Again, we remove the photosynthetic tissue, we remove cover, we remove insulation from those crowns. So this cold snap that we're fixing to get after a fire is going to be much harsher on those plants than it would be if we had a nice grass cover. In the summer, that's going to get much hotter also. And then we expose that ground to wind and sun. If we have dry conditions going in, the plants are weakened. We have dry conditions afterward, and we have a very severe fire. And we'll talk a little bit about what makes a fire severe from a plant standpoint. Any of y'all ever go up 287 into Colorado? Just before you get into Colorado, in 2011, both sides of the highway burned. Mid-summer, it was like July, it was 100 degrees. Up until about 3 years ago, the man who owned that property hadn't even replaced the fence along the highway, because it had burned it so severely, and we had such dry conditions before and afterwards. Very little happened. After the fire in 17 here, we had decent soil moisture going into it. It was a fast-moving fire, so we didn't have fires stay in any one place too long. And then we got fairly decent conditions afterwards. I mean, I am not shortchanging how bad that was, but the recovery was much faster under those kind of conditions. We get more uniform defoliation. So in some ways, this can be better than that severe grazing, because we're hurting the stuff we don't like just the same as we're hurting the stuff that we do. Because we remove that litter, we have other issues. We may cause direct damage to perennial plant structures. I would nearly bet after the fire in 2017, did you go out and find where a tree had burned down into the ground? You can kill mesquite like that. That's a dang sanguine way to go about it, but it can happen. And you may release some plants that normally were being suppressed. And that can be a good thing or a bad thing, depending on which ones they are. Fire effects are a result of the heat generated, the duration of the heat. We can have a really hot fire if it just goes through and in 5 minutes it's over. that may not be nearly as bad of a problem as having just a creeping little fire with flame lengths this tall, but they just go along really slow and they just cook those crowns, and we end up with more trouble from that than we do the really hot, fast-moving fire. And then the opportunity for recovery afterwards. We get plenty of rain afterwards. We keep the cattle off for a little while. We may not even have to keep the cattle off for a little while. Oklahoma State is making a dang good living going in and burning pieces of pastures, and they just let the cattle concentrate on the burn. They rest the rest of the pasture, and then they burn another patch next year. And they're saying, you don't need to take no cows out of the pasture, you just keep going. Now, they're getting 36 to 42 inches of rainfall where they live. We get half that. So, Dr. Fullendorf and I have a little bit of a difference of opinion as to the widespread applicability of their methods. But it can happen. All of that is driven by moisture in the soil and in the fuel. There are some plants, juniper is one of them. You can use juniper as a fire break if the moisture is high enough. If it's not high enough, all that is a gigantic inferno waiting to happen. And so fuel moisture is a huge issue. The moisture in the soil is a huge issue as far as how fast do we expect this to come back. If we have moisture in the litter, but the top is dry, we can do things like little blue stem that's gotten kind of rain. We can go burn the tops off of it, leave the litter, and we're better off all the way around because now we can get the livestock to eat it. Wind speeds, the temperature, and the stage of growth when the fire occurs. If we're earlier in the season, we have more of a chance for the grass to recover this year. Right? Wind speed is going to affect how fast that fire travels and the heat of the fire. Temperature affects how fast it can spread mostly. Growth conditions and management after the fire we've already talked about, and then because of that, we can have after a fire, basically next year is just like it was going to be anyhow, or it may be 7 or 8 or 10 years getting back to what it was, depending on what we had before and after. What we can manage after fire, cover. We can manage water through cover. We can't irrigate rangeland, right? We can manage to some extent plant selection by the cattle. The gentleman talked about using fertilization or like 2,4-D is a great one to talk about. You enhance the sugars in the plants and you get animals to use them better. We can manage selection by where and when we have animals in them. We can manage it by the stocking intensity that we have while they're there. We can manage how long they're in there and how long the animals are out, and that can affect which plants regrow in preference to other plants. And that affects the competitive relationships among those plants, and we can change over the plant community over time.
Tim, he's gonna work on that computer while you're talking.
Okay. in some cases, we can look at fire as what I refer to as an insurmountable opportunity. Maybe you've been wanting to make some changes to your operation, this may be your chance to do so. If you've got an area that's been all really dominated by perennial freon, or broom snakeweed, or annual broomweed, this may be your lucky day, or juniper. If you've had fences that you didn't really like where they were, now's your chance to change that up, right? We can maybe get more equitable distribution over time. We can, if we may want to put in more pasture. That can get us more flexibility in operation, and we may be able to use what some people will call bonus plants. We think a lot about things like little barley and cheatgrass and rescue grass as, oh, that ain't no good. But when they're good, they're really good. That's what I call bonus plants. We can go in, Russian thistles. We can go in, hit them while they're good. When we start seeing them use something we really like a little better, move them to the next pasture, till they back off of that bonus plant. And then we say, well, all right, so now let's start grazing the perennials and do some good with them. That manipulates those competitive relationships. We're hurting that little annual, and we're helping the perennials at the same time, and we're getting some higher nutrition for the cattle while we're at it. We can manage for fuel loads with our grazing. There's guys that are grazing in fire breaks, and you can do it with some of the things we've talked about. You can do it with a fence, and it costs you less money if you're doing it with temporary fence. So all of these things are possible. We've talked about maybe you want to change up infrastructure. You need to change up distribution. Your water development is what you'd like for it to be, so you can come in after a fire and take care of that. That can help you manage the effects of the fire at the same time. So now I'm going to let, especially after the first speaker got started, I asked Andy, I said, should I end mine a little early? And he said, you do what you think best. I'm not sure if I think this best, but I always believe if you ain't making people think, you ain't trying hard enough. So let's don't dissolve into a Rhodesian discussion over it. A Rhodesian discussion is a flat statement followed by a flat denial, followed by verbal abuse, followed by physical violence. But so I want to talk a little bit about the differences between wildfire and prescribed fire, and how prescribed fire can fit into a plan to manage wildfire, and do it with some examples. One thing about prescribed fire is we, at least most of the time, can decide how big that fire should be. Now, when I went through the training, you had to go through wildfire I mean, you had to go through the training for putting out fires to get certified to do prescribed burn. And they were talking about weather conditions that make fire behavior more aggressive. And I'm sitting there saying, well, they're talking about mixing heights get higher, and they talk about lower humidities and things like that. And I went up to the guy afterwards on a break, and I said, I'm not here really. I want to know how to put one out where I want it to go out, but I'm here to learn how to do prescribed burning, not putting out fires. And he said, son, let me tell you something. There's two kinds of people who do prescribed burning. The ones who've had one get away and the ones who are gonna. So I say the spatial scale. Ideally that works. If we're careful, it works pretty dang well. Most of the time. But you always need to have, all right, here's our primary focus for the prescribed fire, and here's the secondary. And we know we can get it out here. That can save you a lot of heartache. A guy, when I was going through some of the training, he said he was the state range con in New Mexico. He said we were burning up on top of this mesa. And I don't remember, it was like they were going to burn 600 acres. He said we set our back fires, we set our flank fires, we just got the head fire started, and it was ringed in and burning to the middle. He said we had like 60 acres left to go. And he said a fire whirl started out in the middle of that thing and picked up a smoldering cow pie, and he said we thought it's going to go out. It's going to go out. It's going to go out. And he said it went right across our black lines, and it went out and dropped that cow pie. And he said 1,100 acres later, we finished out the fire. We burned out the secondary fire area too. He said we took out that whole mesa top. But they had planned for that. So, and they had permissions, and the guy said, it's no worries. We can manage intensity. Now, so you're going to see some pictures here in a minute of a prescribed fire that when the head fire was going through, it was a prescribed wildfire. But we had a lot of black around it, and it went out just like we wanted it to. And it did a lot of good. We can control rate of spread by what's the wind speed, what's the humidity, what's the temperature, how far do we let it run before it hits something that slows it down or stops it, those kind of things. We manage how many people we have scattered around that booger to get it stopped and put out. We manage effects on vegetation, infrastructure, and wildlife because of the way we set it, the fuel loading that we have to begin with, the moisture conditions that we're burning under, and so forth. I have some friends who are big prescribed burners. How many of y'all are big prescribed burners before I make somebody mad? Some big prescribed burners, they ain't never seen a problem they couldn't burn up. I am not one of those guys. There are times when fire can be a really powerful, really beneficial tool. If you've got a non-sprouting woody plant that you want controlled, eastern red cedar, fabulous tool. If you've got broom snakeweed, can be a fabulous tool. But I see a lot of people, I see some prescribed burners, and I would name names, but I don't want to. Basically, they say, if it looks like it'll burn and I can stop it, let's light it up. And I think I can do a lot of good with a lot of other tools that I'm not running near as many risks. If I'm going to use fire, I want to use it because this is the very best tool that we can use for this situation. Conditions before and after. We know the conditions before. So we've got some idea of soil moisture. If I'm going to do a prescribed fire, I either want fairly decent soil moisture going in, or I want a really good chance that there's going to be really good moisture afterwards. Now, if I'm burning something like juniper, that foliage has got to be dry enough that soil moisture may not be all that spectacular right now. But I want all the drought prognosticators saying, hey, we got El Nino is strong. In the next 2 months, we're figuring on it's going to be well above average. Now's the time to burn it.
I've never heard him say that. I've never heard that.
They do once in a while. Wildfires generally, not always, but generally, we're going to have big fuel buildups because we had pretty good moisture conditions the year before, and we've got extremely dry fuel, like now. We will likely have extreme conditions for humidity and wind. Some single-digit humidity, wind conditions way outside of what any sane human being would do for a prescribed fire. And then we're going to have careless or accidental ignition. Somebody's dragging a chain on the highway, somebody's got a bad bearing, a locomotive is going through and burning sparks, blowing sparks out, high wire down. Electric fences, maybe. A couple from my own personal experience. I'm not proud of this, but I didn't start a wildfire, but I thought I was fixing to. I'm welding up a corner, and I thought I had everything covered pretty well, and I had water with me, and I'm welding. I got finished, and I knew I could smell the grass a little bit, and I thought I'll just finish up. I ain't got but another half inch. I raised my hood up, and there's a circle of fire 20 feet in diameter, and I was stepping pretty lively to get that out. Another time, I thought I was in plenty good. Had plenty of. I was in the driveway, for Pete's sake. And I thought, I want to grill a little meat, so I start the fire. And those embers blew a little further than I thought they could. And when he was talking about the wooden fence and had that little barrier between the fence and the house, listen to what he said. Because it don't take long. When it's really dry, I can attest to this, to start that wooden fence on fire, and it can spread very, very quickly. And we were stepping pretty lively on that.
Tim, I had a friend south of here that was gonna do a controlled burn. Had it all set up, had barriers around the edge, the cloud around the edge and everything. He started a fire, a rabbit caught on fire and came out of there and went on the neighbors. Started a fire.
You had one poor choice of terminology that I want to correct.
Okay.
And this was, I mean, they hammered this into us like sand into a rat hole. They said, they ain't no such a thing as a controlled burn. When you light that match, your control is done. All you can do is, you got someplace you're pretty sure you can get it stopped. So, and that, how many of you know somebody who has gotten some appendage taken off in a table saw? I know 3. How many of those guys were beginners that never had run a table saw before? Every one of them I know was extremely proficient with that table saw. And you get so comfortable with it, you think, I got this. I've done this 100 times. And you probably have. And the 101st, now you can't order 10 hamburgers at a time. You approach this always with a great deal of caution and humility. And if you think, oh, I think all I need is a 40-foot black line, make it 60, just to be safe. You get the rat, you get a fire whirl that puts that cow pie out. You got a little break in your fire break and the fire just creeps across it on a patch of grass this wide. And then it gets into some broom snake weed and it's off to the races. So be careful of those things. We can use prescribed fire to manage fuel load. We've got too much sanded, we can go in and put in brakes, or we can take some of it out. We can create a planned, controlled disturbance. So we want to take out some old decadent vegetation and bring on some forage for quail. That's what we're talking about. We can kill thin plants that may be volatile fuel. So eastern red cedar, broomweed, broom snakeweed, sand sage. In some cases, things like WWB doll over a blue stem. That's what we're talking about. Shin oak is not really particularly volatile, but those leaves, those tannins in them, you can start them on fire and they drift along like that feather in Forrest Gump. And they can go a long way before they come back down. So I kind of include that in with volatile fuel. We can control some unwanted vegetation. A lot of annuals, so we've got a cheatgrass flush. We can come in with a early spring burn, and we can hopefully take some of that out. Prickly pear, we can come with a fall burn. If we've got a dry winter, and a lot of times that prickly pear is no longer an issue. We can improve wildlife habitat or manage livestock distribution. I got the dudes at Oklahoma State. Wildlife habitat, we can increase forage. We can change structure. Prairie chickens in this part of the world, they don't like sand sage this tall. They like sand sage this tall. We can get that with a prescribed burn over time. So what I want to show you some pictures of various prescribed burns and the aftermath of some wildfires, and just kind of tell you stories about what's going on. So this, wildfire or prescribed fire? This was a prescribed fire. Now, this was the head fire of the prescribed fire. There ain't no such thing as a controlled burn. That is pretty wild. And if that had been there without a big bunch of black around that, that would have been a disaster of gigantic proportion. But this is what the backfire looked like. And you'll notice this juniper tree here. We started these backfires. This was kind of my first large-scale training fire that I was on. We started that. This is in a lot thicker grass than what most of it was. And I'm watching that. Now, I could have had a 2-year-old holding on to my finger, and we could have stayed ahead of those flames on this backfire. And when it wasn't in this thick of grass, those flame lengths weren't but about like this. And it was coming along, just creeping up to a juniper tree. And I thought, this is going to be just a complete failure, because their main reason for doing it was controlling the eastern red cedar. And it burned up under this cedar. And I'm sitting there watching. I couldn't see the flames anymore. The juniper was the tree was so thick. And this is maybe 5 minutes goes by. And all of a sudden I saw this little black curl of smoke start out of the middle of that tree. And then it started like this. And in about a minute and a half, a tree that size was just a standing black skeleton, and the flame is just creeping along, going towards the next set of trees. And I thought, this is why we call it a prescribed fire. Now, this was about a 1,200 acre fire. Real rolling kind of country. We started that backfire like this about 10 o'clock in the morning. We were closing the head fire about 3 o'clock that afternoon. We had plenty of time to burn a whole bunch of black, and we had a lot of mineral soil around the outside of that burn. And it stayed right where it was supposed to be, and everything went pretty well. That's the aftermath. Now, I want you to pay real close attention. Now, notice there's still a few trees left. The ones that burned, there's skeletons. It did not burn up all the wood. And we've still got, it ain't much, but we've still got a little bit of vegetative cover. This is how surgical it got stopped. Now you can see this wasn't their first prescribed burn. And they're going to have to come back and get some of these. Now we talk a lot about the wildlife effect. I took this picture. This was on the backfire side of that fire. The flames burned, and I saw this covey of quail fly up and fly over the flames and land out in the burned area. And they're out there picking up barbecued grasshopper. I mean, you can see the smoke is still rising out of the ashes, and they're out there having a good time. This was the next morning, and this a flock of turkeys coming out of this unburned area, going over to, I guess, look for some more barbecued grasshoppers. This was in southeast Colorado. And this is an area that was prescribed burned. And you can see the standing skeleton. On the same ranch I believe this one was in 2011 too. They had an 11,000 acre wildfire. This was the part that didn't burn quite so bad. There were areas that lit, I mean, this is a lot of sandstone. There were areas where there was sandstone boulders with piles of little sandstone chips at the base of them where it got so hot that the rocks started flaking off. It got so hot there were no skeletons left. It just evaporated the tree. We were scared. I mean, you'll notice here, this is goldenrod. That was the only plant we could find alive in these areas. That was wildfire. It was so bad that this rangeland, we had exposed roots of the grasses and the trees from the erosion. I mean, we thought it had sterilized the soil. There were places that you could pour out a glass of water and it had just beat up on top of the soil like pouring water on flour. Y'all, wildfire is going to happen. That is a irrefutable fact of life. We can have some say on when and where and how big, or we can just take our chances. This is what happens if you just take your chances. This is some more of the aftermath of that 11,000 acre burn. This one, you actually had a little bit of stuff coming back. This was about, not the spring after that July fire, but the following spring. This area was where they had prescribed burn. This area was where they did not. This did, as hot as that fire was, this was still green after the fire. The fire didn't even carry into that prescribed burn. So, that's all I got. With any questions, with a comment, whatever you want.
So Tim, you talked a little bit about the wildlife. There's been research that's been done that really actually indicates that it improves the wildlife. I liked your barbecued grasshopper story. Maybe those barbecued grasshoppers are nutritious for those animals, those birds. So talk a little more about how prescribed burning improves wildlife?
Well, anytime I have somebody ask me about, how do we improve wildlife habitat, the first question I ask is, which wildlife? Because I can improve wildlife habitat with anything I do. Just, it's gonna be different wildlife with the different things that I do. Where you go in and put in mineral lime for your fire break, that's gonna come up next year to ragweed, sunflower, croton, and, I mean, that is quail heaven. If I go in and burn, now, when I burn has a lot to do with it too. So if I'm doing my burning right when quail and lesser prairie chickens are maybe sitting on a nest, that is probably not the plumb most superb idea that I've ever had in my life. But if I wait until after the chicks are fledged and they can kind of, they can at least fly from me to him, it's probably not a big deal if I'm doing it, if I don't have 40-foot flame heights and, it's carrying 40 miles an hour. That's a wildfire. So if it's just creeping along, now I've got something that's gonna draw in little bugs and they can graze that little green new shoots. Maybe I'm gonna get a few big seeded forbs, and that's gonna be a good thing. Same way with deer and antelope. Rabbits, I don't know that it's gonna make a big difference one way or the other. If you're interested in the whole system and you're worried about, small rodents or lizards and, reptiles, it needs to be moving slow enough where they can go find a hole and get in it and be safe, and then they come out, and it's probably not gonna be a big deal, other than every hawk in the country is gonna be flying over it waiting to see one of them stick their head out and eat them. Short term, you're taking away the cover for the deer and the antelope. Longer term, you're just managing height. Shinnery, you go burn off all the shinnery. Now where you had, half a dozen stems to the square yard, now you're gonna have 40. But if you've got 40, and you can just run a little light patchy burn through there, maybe you go in and graze it a little bit and kind of get a little grass taken out and leave other grass, and you can have it just creep through there, and you leave a stem and you ring another couple. You can take that really dense dog hair stand and you can turn it into a pretty nice open stand that can turn into actual small trees that you can hunt in and still provide some deer habitats. Eastern red cedar, y'all, is getting worse. And it is the kind of thing that it creeps up on. First you see, oh, well, I got, there's a handful of them out there. Well, there's a handful of ones you could see. And for every one of them, there's 50 little ones from this tall to this tall that you can't. And I have yet to see anybody herbicide their way out of that. because you can go treat those individuals that you can see. You're not gonna treat those little bitty ones. Fire can take those little bitty ones out. And y'all, where's Joe Van? Joe, my good friend Joe, one time in this very room, called me a mesquite lover. In front of people. That's the kind of friends I've got. I am not a mesquite lover, but I don't hate mesquite. I mean, there's times to kill it, there's times when it's kind of a waste of money. But if you're killing eastern red cedar, you're just stacking up points in heaven. You are doing God's work. So, I'm with Andy, but this needs to be an all-out war. And I think prescribed fire is one way we can start to get that.
Anybody else got a question for Dr. Steffans? Just got a few minutes here. Joe, you're bound to have a question.
I ain't that good.
John, anything you want to ask leading up into our rancher panel here in a little bit? Good. George, you're pretty quiet back there.
Here,
Would you speak about, you put on your screen about the extreme conditions. And I'm a recovering government agent.
I feel your pain. We're here for you.
But we've gotten a lot better in Amarillo at predicting these days. And so these days are just as predictable as a thunderstorm or tornado, and they're predicted a lot of times 2 weeks out if people are aware of them. You know, it took me a long time to understand. We have these chains dragging every day. We have people that their trash gets away every day. But it's not every day that's going to kill you. And so I think that awareness, and Amarillo, the forecast is great, but folks have to be made aware that on those days you have an extra care. But we know when they're coming. Almost 99% of the time, right? I mean, would you expound on how folks, and maybe everybody knows how to find those, I don't know.
So I'll say something to that. I've got firsthand experience in that. I almost lost my herd in 2011 due to a 65,000 acre fire that was set up by a guy out welding his corner post. He had plenty of warning. There were red flag warnings out everywhere in the media, and he didn't pay attention to it. My friend Joe Lovell back there, lawyer, would probably like to just get all over a guy like that. So, you know, it's common sense. And this guy hated it, but he caused a lot of destruction. So.
And that's, you know, again, it's one of those things. I nearly lost that finger. I was roughnecking. And that rig had settled. And a lot of times when that happens, tool joint comes out and the rotary bushing kind of comes out and gets this away, and it won't drop back in, so you can't set slips. And now the safe way to handle that was you walk over to the doghouse, you pick up a sledgehammer, you go hit the bottom side of that thing, and it goes up and flips back down. But that's a lot of walking back and forth, and it takes more time, and you use up a lot of energy, right? So I was young and strong and had great reflexes, and I figured I can just take and grab that thing and kind of lift up on one side, and it'll do the same thing as that sledgehammer. And I did that hundreds of times. And one night, I did that, and I ended up in the middle of the floor, standing like this, wondering how I'm going to get that out of there. I'll bet that guy had welded hundreds of times, just like that. I got this handle. There ain't much here. I can get this put out. Maybe I got an assistant. He can be watching. I nearly done it myself. Y'all, those days when they get like that. Now, we're preaching to the choir here. None of y'all are going to do that. Hopefully. But I don't know how we get that message out. Where it was talking about the one that started on the north side of Amarillo. Guaranteed, they've done it 100 times. They had out in there, I can promise you, because I drive out in there. They had horse pasture around that thing that looked about like that picture he showed you. And they thought, there's no way that can carry. Except it did. And so we have got to do something about that. And I don't know what it'd be.
But on those days, fuel doesn't even matter.
Yeah, I mean,
If the RH is, so you get down to 6, and you got 40 mile an hour west wind, we squeeze them in green wheat with 5 dozen lines and watch it burn across the street. That just has to be awareness.
I have seen buffalo grass. You couldn't even see the flames. It just looked like the buffalo grass was evaporating. It was that dry. And so but again, until you've seen it, until you know what, the people who haven't been on the line at a wildfire, they don't understand how fast it can go, how easy it can carry, how little fuel there needs to be in those kind of days. And I don't know. I think it's going to take probably some prosecution. You know, people are going to have to go to jail for a while because of that, and then that may get some people's attention.
I think jail's not big enough. Get rid of everything.
No, it's not. But hopefully people find out, hey, there was a woman up in Colorado, I can't remember which one it was back about in the early 2000s. She had broken up with her boyfriend and went out into the mountains and was gonna burn his love letters. And she started like 165,000 acre fire, and she ended up going to prison over it. I mean, that's the kind of thing that I think is gonna get people's attention and say, you know, they really mean that. We're not supposed to burn on those kind of days.
But even red flag day has a different definition than what I'm talking about when the Weather Service says this particular system's coming, it's gonna be here X number of hours. It's up, and then what's gonna happen is gonna flip around, the west wind's gonna turn into a north wind. But if you got 40 miles of line, now you got 40 miles of unprotected line.
Yeah.
It's burning openly. So those days those are the training I went through in Amarillo. They're even different than red flag days. Those are the term is extreme, and they put that forecast out, but I don't know. I don't know if everybody knows how to find it. I don't even always know how to find it, but they say these are days you can die.
And the thing that everybody needs to keep in mind, when I went through the training, I mean, they beat it into us every session. I mean, between breaks. Every time we got, oh, well, you know, in 1992, there was blah, 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 and this happened and that, and 10 guys died. In 1976, there was this and that, here were the conditions, and this was going on, and 4 people died. The vast majority, in fact, of fatal fires are grass fires. They're not forest fires. And lots of people think, oh, well, it's just a grass fire. It's just a grass fire. But, yeah, smoke, hot gases will get you. But even without that, I mean, there are some that it's just can be, especially you get here in this sand where you got some tall grasses, you can have volatile fuels like sand sage, cedar, snakeweed, broomweed. You can have intense flames, you know, this tall, and people die from the flame. And so you've got to keep that in mind. And when he was talking about when the fire department comes and tells you you need to leave, that's not a suggestion. I mean, you need to bug out, and I don't mean gather up a bunch of stuff and, you know, you need to have that go bag, gather your dogs if you're gonna do that, and get in the vehicle and go. Do not hesitate, do not call around, just get out of there.
Let's give Tim a big round of applause. So, it's almost time for lunch, and I'm sure everyone's ready for that. But can you see how important this is? I mean, we're going to have low humidities in this country. It's always been the case. It always will be. Low humidities, standing grass like we have all over this region right now is why we're here today, is because it's a real threat. So I've got some more announcements to make, but I think I'll make those announcements after we eat our lunch. But before we do, is anybody here is Gordon or Jared or Brent, Sylvia's Financial Group, are they here? They're one of our sponsors today from over at Dumas. So I want to thank them. They basically paid the partial cost recovery, Mr. County Agent up here, for you to be here for free today. And Randy, would you stand up? I'd like to introduce Randy from North Plains Electric. Randy is the CEO. And they are the sponsors of our lunch today. North Plains Electric serves many people through this region. And Randy, we appreciate the good faith that you show, and thank you so much for the lunch. Would you like to say anything?
No, just, I hope it's good.
So Alexander's is our caterer today. I think they've got the lunch ready, Krista tells me. If you'll just file down this hall and go through the line down in the foyer by our suite of offices, then bring your plate back here to eat. Mr. John Erickson and a panel of esteemed ranchers from this area are going to have one of the most important presentations of the day right after lunch. And as it regards John has written a book that is phenomenal called Good Smoke, Bad Smoke. And some of you might already seen it on a table. It's available for purchase today. I'm sure, I can't speak for John, but I'm sure knowing him, he would be glad to sign it or autograph it for you today. But I highly recommend it. The last half of the book is literally about the wildfire that was out on his ranch that burned his home down, his office. And John, what would it be, 20 miles, maybe 25 miles as a crow flies from here out to the ranch?
Yeah, 25 to 30.
Yep.
So it wasn't that far. And it was part of the 2017 wildfire that affected several counties, including this one, severely. So go enjoy your lunch. Thanks to North Plains. Let's give them a nice round of applause. And we'll be back here. If you do want to buy a book, it might be a good time to do it.